Hi, I'm Joe Lennon, assistant professor at the Masaryk University Language Center and a consultant at the Masaryk University Writing Lab. And in this bonus episode of 1 Hour to Improve Your Academic Writing, I'm going to answer a question that I get all the time from students. How do I get started writing a research paper? And research paper here could mean pretty much any academic paper, from a brief term paper to a bachelor's or master's thesis, to an academic journal article, basically anything that students are asked to write during their studies. The final form, the final look of these genres can be very different, but they all have one important thing in common. And that's that they require the writer to read other writings, other sources, and somehow respond to those other sources with the writer's own original argument and ideas. And it's not enough to just do the reading and write a response. The paper itself needs to show a clear connection between the reading and the response. To put it another way, an academic research paper requires the writer to show, to perform, we might say, a conversation between themselves and other writers. Yeah, that conversation has to be shown in a very particular academic way, but at heart, it's a conversation. This idea of conversation between the writer and others and creating a record of this conversation, this is really the basic concept underlying all academic work. So, since you have to create this conversation eventually, it's better to start creating the conversation as early in your writing process as possible. And in fact, it's really fantastic if you can start creating the conversation in your notes that you're taking as you do your research. So I'm going to show you a technique for doing that. And that's why this video is called How to Get Started Writing a Research Paper, Turning Your Notes into a Conversation. Let's go back to that question that I hear all the time. How do I get started writing a research paper? And I'm going to be an annoying teacher type person here, and I'm going to answer the opposite question. How do I not get started writing a research paper? And you probably already know the answer because you've probably done it. I know that I have. And it's to do what, unfortunately, many writers do, and that is to divide the research completely from the writing. That is, you spend hours and hours, days maybe, months maybe, reading the sources that you think you will use for your paper. And you might take some notes, but your notes are maybe just a big long list of your sources. Maybe you write down some interesting quotations from the sources here and there, maybe some brief summaries of each source, and that's it. And once you start this process, it's very, very easy to keep going and just become a perpetual research machine. You fall down that rabbit hole of research like Alice in Wonderland, and you disappear and you lose sight of what your ultimate task is, and that's writing the paper. And not only that, you use your researching as a way of procrastinating and avoiding writing the paper. And I've done that too. The problem with doing all the research first, before you start writing, is that when the deadline is approaching and you're finally forced to actually write, what do you have? You have a big list of research sources, but what are you going to do with them? How are you going to respond to them? How are you going to put them into conversation with your own ideas and with each other? You still have all that important work to do, and what's worse, you've probably already forgotten what you read in those first few papers, so you have to maybe read back through them again, and you're panicking because the paper's due tomorrow, but you're still stuck in the reading process. So what do? Probably drink a bunch of coffee, stay up all night, write that paper in a kind of manic fugue state, and the paper that comes out of that process is not great. Because as we say, garbage in, garbage out. And there's two kinds of garbage paper that can come out of this. One is a paper that looks and feels very much like the big, long list of sources that you read. If what you have in your notes is just a list of sources, then what you produce is probably also going to be not much better than a list of sources. A string of summaries of interesting papers maybe, but no interesting argument of your own. Let's call this the "wow, look, I read a bunch of papers" paper. The other kind of garbage is a paper that only has your ideas, your argument, or maybe a description of your experiment. Because after you read all your sources, you had some brilliant last-minute inspiration, and you started writing down a whole bunch of ideas that are related in your mind, maybe, to the sources. But in your paper, in the words there on the page, you don't actually make those connections clear. You don't explain to your reader how and why what you're saying is a response to those sources. Let's call this the "Wow, look, I have a bunch of ideas" paper. The problem is that the response to both of these garbage papers is probably going to be, "So what?" With the first one, the response will be, "Okay, so you read a bunch of papers. So what? What can you show me about how these papers agree or disagree with each other? What trends can we see in these papers? What do they tell us about the state of research in your field? And most importantly, what do they have to do with your own research?" And with the second one, the response will be, "Okay, so you have a bunch of ideas. Okay, you performed an experiment. So what? Are your ideas different from what other people have said? In what ways? What larger question were you trying to answer with your experiment?" Neither of those responses are what we want, but these kinds of papers are often what's produced when writers follow that process of separating the research too much from the writing. So that's how not to write a research paper. Unfortunately, that's how we often end up doing it. But it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to do all your research before you start writing. And in fact, you shouldn't. You can and you should start writing your paper from the very first day of your research process. Basically, you should start writing your paper in your notes. And that means making your notes look like the conversation that you're going to create in your final paper. And the simplest way to do that is to organize and structure your notes so that every note you take, every entry into your notebook has two parts: a record of what you've read and a response to what you've read. And really that's it. That's the basic concept, the basic technique that I want to show you. And in the rest of the video, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what that kind of note-taking actually looks like, a couple of different forms it can take. And you can use these examples as models or as inspiration for your own notes. By the way, I'm not the first to come up with this concept of two-part note-taking. If you poke around online and search for good note-taking techniques or how to take research notes, you might come across the phrase double-entry journal. And this is a popular model for the kind of note-taking method I'm talking about. So let's look at an example of a double-entry journal, since it has a really clear and obvious visual structure. So it's a good introduction to this two-part note-taking method. Here's a template for a double-entry journal, which I found on the website of the Kennesaw State University Writing Center from my beautiful home state of Georgia in the US. And by the way, I'll put links to my sources below the video so you can find them later. This template is very simple, so if you just want to get the very basic idea of double-entry journals, this is a good model to start with. Just to give you an example of what this looks like, I'll fill it in with details about an article that I recently read for my own research into teaching academic writing. At the top of the page, you'll put your source info, the kind of stuff that will eventually go into your reference list, the title, the author, the type and location of your source. Of course, these days we're mainly using online sources, so the DOI or the URL of your source. In this template, it shows all of these as separate lines, but actually, when I take notes, I go ahead and put in the whole reference entry for my source. I type it into my notes exactly how it will look in my final reference list. So I'm just going to plop that in there. This is in APA style, by the way. And that saves me some time later. Because I already have the entry for the reference list. But you don't have to do it that way. That's just another way of going ahead and getting started writing your paper from the first moment. Then you can see my page has two columns. On the left, this is what I called earlier the record of what I've read. On this left side is where you're going to simply record interesting things, interesting moments maybe, that you find in the text. And here in this template, notice that it says quotation or paraphrase. It doesn't say summary of the whole text. And actually, that's a good tip, because often if you jump straight to writing down a summary of the whole text in your notes, this is not super helpful later. It often ends up being too broad, too general. What you want to do in your notes is create little memories for yourself of the text. And the best way to do that is to write down some specific details. Anyway, when you write your actual paper, it's very rare that you'll just write a broad summary of one source. It's much more likely that you'll reference specific details. So again, by recording short paraphrases, quotations from the reading, you're actually getting started with putting together little building blocks of your final paper. So for my source, I'm going to put down what I see as maybe the most important detail. The authors interviewed over 700 US students in their final year of university. What was your most meaningful writing project at university and why? This is my paraphrase of the main research action. But I included some specific details like the number of students. That's a large sample size, 700 students, so I think that number is probably worth mentioning in my final paper. It will impress my readers with the validity of this research. I'm also going to include a direct quotation, maybe something I can imagine would be good to quote in my own paper. In this case, I'm going to quote some language from the final results of the study. They found that meaningful writing, quote, occurs when students are invited to tap into the power of personal connection, immerse themselves in what they are thinking, writing, and researching, experience what they are writing as applicable and relevant to the real world, and imagine their future selves, end quote. Yeah, I've gone over the lines of the chart there into the next box. Yeah, who cares? It's my notes. I'll write outside the box if I want to. The more important thing is if you include a quotation in your notes, that you mark it as a quotation. And maybe the best way to do that is to put it in quotation marks or highlight it in a different color. That's what I usually do. So that you remember that it's a quotation and so that you don't accidentally slip it into your paper without citing the quotation properly. And don't forget to include the page number. You'll need that to cite the quotation properly in your paper as well. Okay, so now I have a short record of the article that I've read, but I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to put something in the right-hand column of my notes. And the right column says, my response and/or reflections. There's a wide spectrum of what that could mean. And what you write as a response might vary a lot, depending on what kind of paper you're trying to produce in the end. But for any and all papers, no matter what the genre, your basic goal in filling out this part is to start that conversation between you and your sources. So let me suggest 4 kinds of responses that do that. My initial reactions or critique, follow-up questions or challenges, compare this source with others I've read, and how I might use this info in my own argument. So, for example, for the first category, my initial reactions, critique, I might write, the first 3 criteria seem obvious, but I didn't fully understand the 4th one. Wish they'd included more examples of student responses. Here, I'm recording my immediate reaction to the text, even a bit of critique, something I felt was missing from the text. This is a really useful thing to write down since it gives me something to respond to in my own paper and maybe something to look for in other sources. For the second category, follow-up questions or challenges, I might write, how can I get students to immerse themselves in their writing when they're distracted by so many other important classes, work, etc.? These are questions to myself that come out of the reading. In this case, I'm using this question to connect this research to my own teaching practice. I don't have answers to the question yet. I'm just writing it down to provoke myself to think further about it. For the third category, compare this source with others I've read. These findings support Engel's 2005 study. Students remembered facts better when they made connections between the facts and their own memories. Here, I'm putting my current source into conversation with another source that I've read. And that's an extremely useful thing to do, especially if you're writing a thesis or a position paper, something where you really need to synthesize all the sources you've read and put it all together into one coherent argument. Showing how all your readings interact with each other is something you'll need to do anyway. So, like I said, go ahead and start doing it immediately. Even just comparing one source to another source, it's a great first step. Finally, for category 4, how I might use this info in my own argument. I'll use these criteria to evaluate and hopefully justify my own lesson plan, which I'm experimenting with in my research. This could go in the discussion section. So from the very start of my reading and research, I'm already starting to imagine how and where in my final paper I'm going to use this info from my source. Obviously, this may not at all be how I actually end up using it, but at least I'm starting to put together an argument. These are just quick examples. There are many other kinds of responses that could be useful. What's important is that you're including in your notes some kind of response to the reading, and you're starting to create that conversation between yourself and the other sources that is crucial for crafting your final paper. One thing I like about the double entry journal format is that it visually represents that conversation. It's almost like a comic strip. The sources are talking on the left, and then you're talking on the right. And it's a balanced conversation. You and the sources get equal talking time, let's say. So the conversation is not dominated either by you or by the sources, but there's an equal exchange there. And actually, that balance is what you want to maintain in your final product, your final paper. That balance is what most good research papers have. Of course, the exact balance won't be the same for every genre. Depending on what you're writing, there'll be a bit more of the sources or maybe a bit more of your response. If you're writing a literature review for your thesis, the balance will be much more on the sources side. If you're writing a position paper, there'll probably be a bit more of your response. That is your reasoning, your conjecture. But in most academic research articles, we do need that balance. If the balance tips one way or the other, if the conversation becomes too one-sided, we get those two kinds of garbage papers I talked about earlier. So the genius of this two-part model of note-taking, where you keep a record of your reading alongside your response to that reading, is that it helps you develop that balance from the very start of your research process. So that idea, that model, is really the main thing that I wanted to show you. But if the double entry journal format seems a bit artificial to you, a bit too strict, formalized, it does to me too. The double entry journal that I showed you is a rather rigid structure, but your notes don't have to look exactly like that to be a successful version of the two-part model. That side-by-side structure, it's really just a way of getting started, maybe, and reminding yourself of the basic model of reading and response. I thought I'd end the video by showing you what my notes for a research paper actually look like, and you'll see that they don't look exactly like the double entry journal, but they do follow the basic two-part model of a record of my reading and a response. So I'm going to show you a historic document, my actual notes that I wrote for one part of my PhD exams several years ago. My PhD was in creative writing and literature, and the subject that I chose for one of my exams was Czech fiction in translation. And for this exam, I had a few months to prepare and read. And then my professor sent me a question, and after that, I had 2 days to write a response in the form of a 10-page essay. So for this exam, it would have been totally impossible for me to save all the planning, all the structuring, writing of my essay for those final 2 days. If I had done that, I would have produced a pile of nonsense, garbage, and I wouldn't have passed my exam. So I knew that I had to start writing the paper while I was doing the reading. So I'll just show you a few excerpts from my notes so you can see how I did that. Here I was reading an article by Milan Kundera. So you can see at the top I have my full reference, and beneath that I have some quotations from the text. And you can see that I not only put them in quotation marks, but I colored them in orange so that I would remember that these were quotations. And then at the bottom, you can see that I'm starting to write my responses. I'm starting to put the main themes that I see in Kundera's text into my own words, and I'm starting to compare other texts that I've read to Kundera's text. So instead of the horizontal left-hand and right-hand model that I showed you earlier, I'm doing it vertically. The quotes from the reading above and the responses below, which is perfectly fine. It's whatever works, whatever makes sense for you. Here's another page that I wrote as I was reading Václav Havel. And again, you can see some quotations, but around the quotations, I have some paraphrases of key details. And then down at the bottom in big capital letters, you can see the word connects. And this is my note to myself that the ideas in the Havel text could be connected compared to things that I read elsewhere. So I'm starting to draw these connections. Here are some of my notes on Kafka. And this is interesting because here, as you can see, I have some quotations, But now I'm starting to put my responses to the quotations above the quotations. So kind of backwards, we could say, from what I showed you earlier. But what I think that reflects is that at this point, I had already been reading and studying for a few months, and I probably already had in my mind some of the main themes or main connections that I was going to make. And so I was starting to develop and write my own claims, my own arguments first, and then look for good examples, good evidence for my claims as I read. So we could say my side of the conversation is starting to take over here. But that's okay, I think. I think you sort of want that to start happening toward the end of your research. And here's the last page I'll show you. And this page, I remember that I wrote this very late in the process, probably a week or two before I wrote the final essay. And by this point, I was fairly sure that one of the main themes of my essay was going to be about how Czech writers of the 20th century use words to show the manipulation of time or the warping of time that they felt. So I was starting to gather together physically in my notes in one place the evidence that I would use to support particular points. And you can see here that I was also starting to leave notes for myself about how I would start the essay. So the structure of the essay was starting to come together, and I was beginning to organize my notes in the same way that I planned to organize the final essay. So what happened in this case is that my notes actually started to become my final paper. I started developing, expanding my little responses here and there, connecting them to other responses, connecting them to the quotations and paraphrases. And I started moving some of the notes around, organizing them into thematic categories. And eventually, the Word document that I was keeping my notes in became the first draft of my paper, or at least a very advanced outline of the first draft. And for the most part, I had my paper written by the time I got the exam question. I had the basic conversations, the arguments there in my notes. Obviously, I had to tweak my ideas a little bit, reorganizing them a little bit to fit the exact question from my professor. And I had to flesh my ideas out a bit more. But the basis of the final paper was there in my notes. Okay, one last point about technology. I realized that in the example that I've just shown you from my PhD exam, I'm using what now might seem like kind of old school technology. I kept my notes in Microsoft Word, I composed in Word. Obviously, there are all sorts of other platforms and apps besides Word that we're using these days for taking notes, keeping track of sources, composing academic papers. To be honest, I still use Word as my basic platform for composing, but I also use Google Docs a lot. I don't use LaTeX, but I know many students use it. I use a citation manager to keep track of my research sources. Personally, I use Zotero. Obviously, there are many other good ones. But no matter what apps or technologies you're using for keeping notes, you can still apply the basic double-entry note-taking method I've shown you. It's just a matter of adapting the method to the tech that you're using. So, for example, if you're using Zotero as your citation manager, there's a function to attach notes to each specific source. Here's an example of what that looks like. On the left, I have my list of sources, and then on the right, you can see a note which is connected to one of those sources. And you can see that I'm still following the basic two-part structure that I've shown you. I've got a quotation from the source, highlighted with quotation marks around it to remind me that it's a quotation, and of course the page number, so I can cite it later. And then below it, I have my response to that quotation. In this case, it's a criticism of the paper as a whole. I didn't find the main claim of the author very compelling. And so the quotation I've chosen is one example of the, to me, unconvincing evidence that they're giving. So I'm still following the basic note-taking structure here in Zotero that I would follow in Word or any other platform. A record of what I've read and a response to what I've read. And not only can you use the same basic note-taking structure in whatever app you use, some of these programs have nice fancy tools that actually make it easier to create the kinds of connections between your sources and your responses that I've been talking about. Of course, like any tools, they can also block some of those connections, shut off the conversation you want to create, and unfortunately facilitate the kinds of garbage papers I showed you earlier. I'm not going to go into detail here about all the advantages and disadvantages of these programs. the ways they could help or hurt you in your writing process. In fact, that's what I'd love to hear about from you. So if you have a favorite technology for keeping notes, especially if you have one that you think helps you build that conversation between you and your sources, tell us about it in the comments. So I hope I've shown you a useful way to get started writing a research paper from the very first day of your research. The key is to start writing your paper in your notes by including 2 parts to every entry in your notes: a record of what you've read along with a response to that reading. So try it if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments if it works for you. And also let me know if it doesn't work for you. I'd love to hear your own tips, techniques for note-taking, and things that have worked or not worked for you. And that's all for this bonus installment of 1 hour to improve your academic writing. Check out the other videos in the series. And if you're working on a piece of writing in English and would like to consult with me or another writing specialist, go to our website and make an appointment. See you in the Writing Lab.